Hello and welcome to Since Attlee Churchill, the podcast about British political history since the Second World War. I'm Lee Evans, a historian of the Conservative Party.
And I'm Richard Johnson, a historian of the Labour Party and Lee's husband. In each episode, we will be chewing over delightful morsels of British political history.
Now, this is our final midweek episode before Christmas, and Christmas isn't really a time for politics. It's a time for carol services, family gatherings, addresses from the monarch, and dodgy Agatha Christie adaptations. But for our last podcast before Christmas, we thought we'd see what our politicians had contributed to the way in which we think about Christmas, and also how some of them have spent Christmas themselves.
And so to kick us off, I thought we would begin by going a little bit before the post-war period, but it's still during the lives of Attlee and Churchill, and they're in Parliament at this time. We're going to go back to the 1930s when we heard the very first Christmas broadcast from the monarch. Now, this is a tradition that everyone in the United Kingdom and throughout the Commonwealth realms will be familiar with. It's the broadcast from the monarch that is quite a personal broadcast, not one of great political substance. It's usually one that the monarch writes themselves, although not in the instance of the very first one. So the very first Christmas broadcast took place in 1932. The reigning monarch at the time was George V. He'd been on the throne since 1910. Radio had taken off the previous decade in the 1920s. The BBC was founded in 1924 and had become a very popular medium with millions of listeners in Britain and around the British Empire as it was at the time. And Sir John Reith, the first director of the BBC, had been very keen for the King to give a live broadcast at Christmas. But for many years, the King had resisted. He was concerned that it was politicizing Christmas. Some of the concerns that Lee has just mentioned earlier about mixing politics and Christmas doesn't always go too well. But things changed in 1932 for a few reasons. The first was that this was during the height of the Great Depression, and there was a growing sense within the British royal family that there was a growing gap of affection between the British working class, who were deeply suffering during the Depression, and their perception of the distant and grand life of the monarch. And so there had been attempts by the royal family to engage more directly with the public. For example, the Prince of Wales at the time, Prince David, the future King Edward VIII, had made an effort to go to mining communities and go even to working men's clubs to talk directly to the working class. And he was struck how working class voters were pretty cool on him and the monarchy, and that was some cause for concern. A second reason why George V conceded to doing this Christmas broadcast was that this was just after the 1931 Statute of Westminster, which gave the sort of blueprint or the early start to the Commonwealth and a sense of greater autonomy for some of the different dominions and Commonwealth, what would become Commonwealth realms. And this was an opportunity for the King to speak to that dynamic and to speak to those relations. But third, and it seems, according to the historical accounts, perhaps the most decisive factor was the Prime Minister of the day, Ramsay MacDonald. Now, Ramsay MacDonald was the very first Labour Prime Minister. He first became Prime Minister in 1924. It was a remarkable event in British history for the formation of a outwardly socialist government at the invitation of the King, who was still in 1924 was George V. By 1932, Ramsay MacDonald had taken on a slightly different character. He was now the leader of the national government, a coalition with the Conservatives and a small rump of Labour MPs. MacDonald had been expelled from the Labour Party for his role in creating this national coalition. But of course, Ramsay MacDonald was really our first working class prime minister. MacDonald was from a very poor background. His mother was a maid, single mother. Um, he was born out of wedlock in rural Scotland and was a self-taught man in many respects. And George V had quite a good relationship with MacDonald. Indeed, some people think the reason why MacDonald formed this national government was because George V encouraged him to do so. And he asked MacDonald, "What do you think I should do?" And MacDonald thought it was a good idea. He said to the king, "Look, you don't need to be uh, like the BBC broadcasters." There was a concern the king had that, it's funny to think, but the king was worried that he wasn't as polished as some of the presenters that he heard on the radio in his speech. And he was worried that he would sound out of place on the radio, which is a pretty extraordinary thing for a king to think. MacDonald said, "Don't worry about that. Just speak naturally, speak from the heart. And this can be a personal message. It doesn't have to be a formal address." The king was still quite worried about it, so the suggestion was then made that a script would be written for him, which of course he could see in advance, but it would be a broadcast live, but with a script. And Rudyard Kipling was drafted in to write the speech. It was only 251 words, and it was over pretty quickly. But just emphasizing Ramsay MacDonald's role here, Dr. Matthew Glencross, who has been a historian at King's College London, said, "Yet had Downing Street and in particular Ramsay MacDonald not so enthusiastically championed the BBC's idea in 1932, the monarch's speech might be one Christmas tradition we would be without." So I do think we have Ramsay MacDonald in part to thank for this now very, very well-established British Christmas tradition.
It's a remarkable thought for any British person to imagine Christmas really without the Queen's or now the King's speech. Certainly a great pressure in some respects on George V. I mean, by now, by the time you're listening to this, certainly even if it's before Christmas, the King's speech will have been recorded and polished and ready to go at 3 o'clock on Christmas Day. So no pressure this time for the King to do it live. But it's remained really ever since one of these great fixtures of the day, ever since in the mid-late 1950s when it went onto television, and always remains quite strikingly, I think, given the changes that have gone on in British society, one of the most watched events of Christmas Day.
Yes, although there have been a few years since George V's broadcast where the monarch hasn't given a Christmas speech. And one of those was in 1969 when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II decided that she had been overexposed, in a sense, to the public and declined to give a Christmas message. So that year, there was a documentary broadcast about the royal family. It was the idea of Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Queen's husband, and it was a pretty intimate look behind the curtain, so to speak, at day-to-day life in the royal household. And the Queen took the view that she had been on television too much in 1969, and so she wasn't going to impose again at Christmas. Extraordinary thought, really, these days when you think about the social media output and the expectations and demands of the monarch to be very visible on television and digital media today.
There's that phrase that is attributed to the late Queen saying, "I have to be seen to be believed." And that is very much the approach now, clearly not in 1969.
Yes, but this was a controversial decision, and in particular, it upset a left-wing Labour MP called Anne Kerr, who we've done a podcast episode on. Anne Kerr was one of the leading Eurosceptic voices in the Labour Party. She founded an organisation called Women Against the Common Market, and we have an episode on that. But in 1969, Anne Kerr, when she hears this news there will not be a Christmas broadcast, she takes it upon herself on House of Commons notepaper to write directly to the Queen, beseeching her that she change her mind. And I found this letter, which is, to my understanding, otherwise has never been published before, in the archives of Anne Kerr, which is held at the Hull History Centre. I'll just read an excerpt from the letter. From Mrs. Anne Kerr MP, House of Commons, London, SW1, 21st of October, 1969. Your Majesty, I am writing to ask you, please, to think again about the cutting totally of your Christmas message. My reasons for this are twofold. First, I think some type of sound and television broadcasting on Christmas Day by Your Majesty means an immense amount to families in the United Kingdom, and particularly to our elderly, handicapped, and sick people who often live alone who are in hospitals, and who therefore have very little else to link them with the community outside on this very special day. Secondly, I hate to see our bonds with the Commonwealth even further eroded. Anyone in public life realizes the strain imposed on Your Majesty by reaching out to what is probably the largest audience in the world. But I know deep disappointment will be experienced in millions of homes and even further damage done to the British Commonwealth unless Your Majesty and your delightful family can make direct contact of equivalent value to that past year's. Would it really be too much to suggest that 10 minutes of your Christmas tea time be broadcast? I think this would be fascinating for people I have particularly in mind, and would relieve Your Majesty of some strain. Though as a mother, I fully recognize it might impose other problems. I have thought carefully of this since learning of your decision this morning, and hope of joy and value may yet emerge for the people that I have so much in mind, more than 100,000 of whom I represent in Parliament. Your affectionate and sincere subject, Anne Kerr.
So people who have listened to our episode on Anne Kerr will know that she was more than a little bit crackers. But on that, I think I can certainly agree with Anne Kerr about the value of the Christmas message.
A wise woman.
Not quite. I also wanted to talk a little bit about firsts, but in this case, something of rather less significance. We're now quite used to seeing every year the Prime Minister and senior politicians will do a Christmas card. And one of the standard formats for that is to have a picture of the Prime Minister, usually but not always with their spouse or sometimes with children as well. The most famous one of these perhaps that always lingers in my mind, and perhaps it might also be seared into the minds of listeners, is the Christmas card that Tony and Cherie Blair sent out in 2014, with him showing a grimaced smile and it almost looking as if he's about to square up to somebody in a bar, and Cherie is holding him back with her hand on his chest. But when did all of this begin? When did this habit of sending out Christmas cards from the Prime Minister or from the party leader with their own image on it? Well, I found a letter that Lord Lexton, who's an esteemed historian of the Conservative Party, wrote to the Times in 2015. And he said this: "The first Prime Minister to convey the message of the angels with a Christmas card decorated with their own image seems to have been Stanley Baldwin. In 1928, he dispatched from Number 10 a small oval photograph of himself, decked with holly and mistletoe, with the words, 'May God, goodwill, and good neighbourhood be your company.' Xmas 1928. Perhaps even this impeccably one nation message stirred divine displeasure." Lord Lexton writes, "At the general election the following year, Baldwin lost the largest single-party parliamentary majority of modern times." So it seems that the punishment for sticking yourself on your Christmas card can be electoral, as well as many, many years later, that image of Tony Blair and Cherie that we remember so well.
These days, MPs, I think, take two approaches to their Christmas card. One is to put a picture of themselves on the card. The other is to invite a child to draw a picture of Christmas or perhaps something in their constituency. Some MPs turn this into some kind of competition for local schools. I can remember years ago, I did work experience for a member of the European Parliament. I probably won't say who it was, who kind of combined this, where he would hire a cartoonist every year to draw a picture of him in some kind of Christmas scene. One year he was a shepherd, Another year he was a wise man. Another year he was one of the people in Bethlehem. Another year he was Father Christmas. And then these were distributed to uh, many, I think thousands of people around the constituency. I can remember when I did work experience, a large part of that was sticking stamps on each of these letters and then finding post boxes around Cambridge to distribute those cards. They always struck me as a little bit on the wrong side of egotistical, but it's always a difficult balance for a politician who wants to uh, demonstrate a bit of self-promotion. I think that's inherent in politics, and maybe a little bit of artistic flair at Christmas time.
Absolutely. That reminds me, in fact, of one of the Christmas cards I've seen from the party leaders this year. It's not a cartoon of himself, but it is a cartoon. It's Ed Davies' Christmas card, which I think is very good. It's an angel appearing to the shepherds, and the angel is saying, yes, it's a stunt, but it's got a really important message behind it. And I think that probably means Ed Davey wins the Christmas card competition for the year. We're just going to take a quick break, and then we'll be back by looking at how some of our prime ministers spent Christmas. So over the last couple of days, Richard and I have been going through some of the books here at home to look at how our prime ministers often spend Christmas. Now, it's quite hard to find things out really about what they did because it's a very private time for them. They're not necessarily burdened by making public statements or appearances at Christmas in the way the sovereign is, and therefore it's usually quite discreet what they get up to. But we do know from diaries and also from biographies and other sources how some of our prime ministers spent Christmas. So Catherine Carter, in her superb and much celebrated book on Chartwell, the Churchill country house, wrote about how Churchill and his family would often spend Christmas, and said, "The magic of Christmas at Chartwell was its constancy. The same group returned to the Churchill's corner of Kent most years, reuniting on Christmas Eve. The noise of a cacophony of cousins filled the house at Christmas. But it wasn't all just jovial times and good fun, because, quote, for Churchill, however, even Christmas Day was a working day. His secretaries had to be on hand too, and later recalled he was never terribly good-tempered because he couldn't get anyone on the telephone, and it made him so cross." In fact, there's a great quote about this that apparently Churchill said to some members of his team, where he wished one of them a busy Christmas and a frantic New Year. So I think we can have some retrospective sympathy for the people who worked for Churchill even at Christmas time. One of the exceptions to how Churchill would spend Christmas came in 1941. So, of course, at this time, we're in the midst of the Second World War. It's very shortly after the Japanese have bombed Pearl Harbor, and then the United States goes from this supportive role to this engaged role in the conflict, something which, of course, in the big picture in the longer term would be much to Churchill and Britain's advantage. And shortly after Pearl Harbor, Churchill went to the United States and did spend Christmas 1941 in America. On Christmas Eve, he joined the president on the White House balcony to help light the national Christmas tree. He also addressed a joint session of Congress and laid a wreath at Mount Vernon, which is the home of George Washington, just outside Washington, D.C. in Virginia. And on Christmas Day, 1941, Churchill even went to church with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the then president. They attended the Foundry Methodist Church about a mile or so north of the White House. Of the two of them, it's probably true that Roosevelt was the better churchman than Churchill. Churchill had once described himself as being like a flying buttress in his relationship with the church, supporting it from the outside rather than being dedicated to it inside the church walls. But I think that Christmas forms a remarkable example of Christianity across the oceans, of an allied partnership amidst war, and really two of the greatest men that either country ever produced, spending their Christmas time together. Into the post-war years, which after all is truly the remit of this podcast, we've indulged ourselves by going a little bit further back. I spent some time the other day looking at Macmillan's diaries. Now, Macmillan's diaries are really the most comprehensive prime ministerial diaries of the post-war era. And quite a number of years ago, they were very well put together by Pippa Catterall, who went through the diaries and edited them and would publish them in 2 volumes. But the challenge to understanding how Macmillan spent Christmas is that they are overwhelmingly political diaries. They're not really personal. He doesn't talk about Dorothy all that much. He barely mentions his children, but there are some mentions of Christmas during his premiership. So he would spend Christmas at Birch Grove, which was his country house in Sussex. Lots of prime ministers spend their time over Christmas at Chequers, especially those who don't have a country house of their own, which of course is quite common now, but once upon a time, a great many of our prime ministers did have their own country house. One of the reasons why Macmillan doesn't always write about his personal life in his diaries is that, of course, his personal life wasn't especially happy. Although he had a very long marriage to Dorothy, her long-standing affair with Bob Boothby was incredibly widely known. But clearly there were some happy Christmases. So Macmillan writes on Christmas Day 1960 in his diary, "A very happy day. Church at 8 a.m. and 11 a.m. Luncheon of 8, tea 30 in all, dinner 18. So lots of people gathered around at their home. Games, etc. after dinner. All the children, with wives and husbands, and all the grandchildren were present as well." So quite a nice scene there of a Christmas at Birch Grove. Better than in 1962 at any rate, when Macmillan was ill, and his morbid view of his own health, which recurred throughout his life, was clear. He wrote, quote, "I woke at 6 a.m. with a cold on my chest, laryngitis, acute pain, no temperature, or rather, abnormally low. Could not go to church, which is sad. Stayed in bed till tea. Dr. Somerwell came to see me and reassured me about my throat. From the acute pain, I felt sure I had cancer." Of course, he didn't have cancer. I think he did have some hypochondriac habits, Harold Macmillan, which actually, to be fair, I fully sympathise with. It's interesting, of course, that he mentions in both of those diary entries going to church on Christmas Day. Not especially surprising. It is, of course, one of the two great Christian festivals of the year. No offence to all of the rest of them, but really Christmas and Easter are the two standout occasions of the year for many Christians. But church was actually always important to Harold Macmillan. And as a slight addendum to this, in Alec Douglas Hume's memoirs, Alec Douglas Hume, of course, being Foreign Secretary under Harold Macmillan and also his successor as Prime Minister, Douglas Hume wrote, quote, "Not long ago, I asked Harold Macmillan if he could put his finger on the point in time when the slide in values in Britain began to set in. His answer came without hesitation. The day when people stopped going to church regularly on a Sunday morning. So perhaps we can think this Christmas the truly Macmillanite thing to do would be to get up and go to church."
Now, thinking of prime ministers who were a little bit more active and maybe even hedonistic, let's turn now to the two Labour prime ministers of the 1960s and 70s, Harold Wilson and Jim Callaghan. Now, as Lee mentioned, it's quite difficult sometimes to find good accounts of Christmas celebrations. In some ways, it might be a little surprising, but in other ways, it's quite understandable, as most politicians tend to like to switch off then and use that as private family time. But I did find a couple of recordings of Christmas parties at 10 Downing Street, recorded by Bernard Donahue, who was a political advisor to both Wilson and Callaghan. Donahue was still alive and someone that we have had the good fortune of meeting on a few occasions. And this is what he writes in 1974. He says that there was a Christmas party that the Permanent Secretary, Robert Armstrong, was playing the piano at. The staff were dancing and singing to Christmas carols. I assume quite a lot of merriment was taking place because eventually the traditional lyrics of the Christmas carols were being substituted for funnier or ruder lyrics in their Christmas carols. Donahue doesn't record the specifics of that. But what he does record is that Mary Wilson, Harold Wilson's wife, got quite upset over this and told them to stop because it was, quote, blasphemous for them to sing in such a way. A few years later, 1977, now Jim Callaghan is Prime Minister. Donahue recounts another jolly Christmas party. This time there wasn't live music of someone playing the piano, Callaghan did want to put music on, but he realized that he had no music to play. And so, fortunately, the Prime Minister lives next door to the Chancellor at number 11. The Chancellor of the time was Denis Healey. Denis Healey was a very musical man, a man who liked to play the piano, and there are some wonderful images of Denis Healey playing the piano on the back of a flatbed lorry during the general elections in his constituency in Leeds East. But also, Healey liked to listen to records, and so Healey duly obliged with a record player and some records for them to play for the staff Christmas party. But I think the queen of Labour Christmas parties has to be Barbara Castle. She is someone who does write a great deal about Christmas festivities in her diaries. She would always spend Christmas at her country home in Buckinghamshire called Hell Corner Farm, which Lee and I have had the privilege of staying at. And this is one of her diary entries from 1967, which I'll record. Christmas over. The party a great success. People said, what an ideal setting, the farm, for the traditional Christmas. And so it is. I spent Sunday clearing up the mess. 8 glasses smashed. A record. So it was a good party. Now, at this time, Barbara Castle is Transport Secretary, and she's had this huge campaign about road safety and stopping drink driving. And she is responsible famously for the introduction of the breathalyzer and stop tests of drivers in the evening by the police to see if they had been drinking. It's very controversial, but it had been seen as a success in getting road deaths down. But of course, the problem with Barbara Castle is that living in the countryside, she's not well connected to public transport. And we can confirm that where her house is, Hell Corner Farm, it really is rather remote and difficult to get to even today. And so Barbara Castle had to think, how do I have all these guests come to my party, drinking the night away, smashing glasses, and then not getting me in trouble for drink driving on the way home and getting stopped by one of my breathalyzing police officers? So she had an ingenious scheme. The minibus to take people home worked perfectly. Absolutely no one drunk and drove. But horror of horrors, our housekeeper, Mrs. Bracey, collapsed with a Christmas morning flu. Somehow, I struggled through alone, with various people lending a hand when they could get a moment from their children. During all this, I kept getting requests to appear on TV to talk about the marvellous reduction in the Christmas accident figures. So it sounds like it was a pretty good Christmas at Hell Corner Farm for Barbara Castle in 1967. I wish I was there.
Yes, we should say that when we went to Hell Corner Farm, it wasn't 1967, nor when Barbara Castle was alive. It's subsequently been used as a bed and breakfast, and we booked to stay there. But it was quite nice to see some of the backdrop and the scenery where these events would have taken place, including summer parties as well as Christmas parties, and one occasion when Harold Wilson's chair collapsed from underneath him and the Prime Minister was thrown to the ground. Maybe something we'll return to in a future episode as Richard undoubtedly delves back into the Barbara Castle diaries. I wanted to move us on to another iconic woman of post-war British politics, Margaret Thatcher. When she died, John Whittingdale, who had worked very closely with Margaret Thatcher before becoming an MP, said, quote, "She had enormous compassion. If ever she found out that somebody was alone at Christmas, she would always say that they should come and spend it at Chequers with her. Ronnie Miller, the playwright, told me that he would spend many months trying to think of excuses why he would be busy, because being with Margaret Thatcher at Christmas might not be the most relaxing way to spend it. And well, on that front, it seems that he definitely wasn't wrong, because Tim Bell, Lord Bell, who was an advertising executive who worked on the Thatcher campaigns in the 1980s and eventually became a Conservative member of the House of Lords, was very close to Margaret Thatcher. They worked together very closely. He wrote in his autobiography, Right or Wrong, about spending Christmas at Chequers with the Thatchers. Was it fun? Was it jolly? No, of course not. It was trying and traditional and terribly polite, and sort of horrible, really. There were absolutely no presents. Presents were not part of Christmas, as far as Margaret was concerned. No Christmas jumpers, no open-necked shirts, no charades, no games, and no children. Apart from the year we had our 3-month-old baby Daisy, and she was too small to leave at home, so I had to get special permission to take her with us. The protocol for the day was utterly traditional and exactly the same every year. Now, it wasn't necessarily one of those Christmases that's a little bit open-ended. You drop in when you want to and leave when you must. Instead, apparently, it would start at 12:30 sharp and all be centred around the Queen's speech. And Bell would write that during the speech, you couldn't speak, you couldn't cough, you couldn't move. You had to get yourself into a reasonably comfortable position, because if you shifted once after it had started, she would give you the killer death stare. Now, of course, the relationship between Margaret Thatcher and the Queen was much discussed at the time and has been much discussed since, mostly focusing on occasions when they may have disagreed, but often tempered, I think, sensibly, by an appreciation for the great respect and reverence that Margaret Thatcher held the Queen in, often typified by, and you can find photographs of this if you head to Google, the incredibly low and deep curtsy that Margaret Thatcher would do every time she entered the Queen's presence. But Bell would also write, she would not actually criticise the Queen, but she would usually make a sarcastic comment at the end, something like, "Oh dear, she's going to feel sorry for the poor again," which is a perfectly fitting thing for the sovereign to do, not least at Christmas. Bell does reflect that not all that many people seem to have really enjoyed spending Christmas with the Thatchers, as generous as it was for her to hand out the invitations to join them at Chequers, the Prime Minister's country home. So in many ways, it's bittersweet what happened in Christmas 1990, when Margaret Thatcher is challenged for the Conservative leadership and ultimately resigns as Prime Minister. It's November 1990, and she eventually leaves office at the very end of the month. So by then, already the Christmas invitations had gone out, and all had to be withdrawn. It was apparently one of the things that she felt most sad and bitter about in the weeks after her resignation from office, but perhaps to at least some of the guests, it came as a bit of a relief.
I have to say, I would much rather an invitation to Barbara Castle's house at Hell Corner Farm than to Chequers with Maggie Thatcher.
I don't think anybody would dare to break a glass at Chequers with Mrs. Thatcher.
8 smashed, a record. I wanted to finish with an anecdote about a British cabinet minister's best Christmas gift ever. It's 1975, Labour is in office, and Tony Benn is the Secretary of State for Energy in the Ministry of Harold Wilson. And Benn's wife, Caroline, gives him a very little gift, a little book. It's the Communist Manifesto by Marx and Engels. And Ben had never read the Communist Manifesto before, and once he unwrapped the present and saw what it was, he spent the rest of Christmas devouring it and reflecting on the marvels that were in the Communist Manifesto. And this is what he writes in his diary. I read the Communist Manifesto yesterday, Christmas Day, never having read it before, and I found that without having read any communist text before, I had come to the Marxist view. It is the most astonishing thing, and I feel so ignorant that at the age of 51, as a socialist politician in Britain, I should never have read that basic text before, and I am a bit shy to admit it. So we will leave it here by asking our audience, what was your favourite or best Christmas gift this year? Did any of you receive a copy of the Communist Manifesto? Or perhaps some other storied text that you'd always meant to read but never quite got around to doing so? I'm sure we'll get a few books in our Christmas stockings, but probably none written by Marx and Engels.
Certainly not that I bought anyway. Well, I very much hope that you all get something better than the Communist Manifesto this Christmas. And we wanted to thank you all for listening to Since Attlee Churchill throughout the year. We'll be back on Sunday with our podcast about the February 1974 general election, part of our Heath versus Wilson elections mini-series. We'll see you then.
Merry Christmas.